Lila Brandt, a self-proclaimed activist with a massive online following, is caught on camera mocking retired Army Major Ethan Carver at a public event. She accuses him of being nothing more than a pawn of war, fueling an online frenzy. But as the veteran silently walks away, something unimaginable happens. Lila soon finds herself drawn into a chain of events that will force her to confront not only her own hypocrisy, but also the devastating cost of her words. Lila Brandt was the kind of person who never minced her words. She lived for debates, thrived on confrontation, and relished every opportunity to challenge the status quo. A self-proclaimed warrior for justice, she carried herself with an air of intellectual superiority that her loyal followers admired. But today, at the annual Veterans Charity Gala in downtown Portland, she was about to meet her match. The gala was a glittering affair, attended by influential people from all walks of life. It was an event dedicated to honoring retired soldiers and raising funds for those struggling to adjust to civilian life. Lila had been invited as a guest speaker, her reputation as a passionate advocate for human rights preceding her. However, her speech that day would take an unexpected turn. Standing at the podium, Lila scanned the audience with a mixture of confidence and disdain. Among the sea of faces, her eyes locked onto a man sitting in the back row. He was dressed in a simple suit, his military pins glinting under the soft lights. His name tag read, Major Ethan Carver, Retier. But Lila needed no introduction. She had heard of him before, a decorated war veteran whose service spanned 2 decades. Ethan sat silently, his posture straight and composed. There was something about his presence that unsettled Lila, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in his gaze, or the way he seemed to absorb her every word without flinching. Whatever it was, it made her want to push harder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lila began, her voice ringing clear across the hall. "Today, we gather to honor those who have served our country. But let us not forget to ask the difficult questions. What does it mean to serve? And at what cost?" She paused for effect, letting her words sink in. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the room. "As someone who fights for justice, I cannot ignore the reality of war," she continued. "It is a machine that consumes lives and spits out destruction, and those who participate in it, whether knowingly or not, become its pawns." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable. "Major Carver," Lila said, directing her gaze at him, "you've dedicated your life to this machine. You've carried out its orders, regardless of the consequences. Do you ever wonder if your actions truly served the greater good? Or were you simply a pawn of war?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ethan, waiting for his response, but he said nothing. Instead, he rose from his seat and walked toward the stage. The air grew heavy with anticipation. When he finally stood before her, Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "Miss Brandt," he said, "you speak of justice and morality as if they are absolutes. But let me tell you something. On the battlefield, there are no absolutes, only choices. Choices that no one should have to make." Lila was taken aback by the weight of his words, but she refused to back down. "And those choices," she countered, "are what perpetuate the cycle of violence. By following orders, you allowed yourself to be complicit in the very injustices you claim to fight against." Ethan's gaze hardened. "You assume much about a life you've never lived," he said. "You speak of complicity, yet here you stand, judging from the comfort of your privilege. Do you know what it's like to see a child cry because their home has been destroyed? To carry the weight of lives you couldn't save?" The room grew quieter still, and for the first time Lila hesitated. Ethan's words carried the kind of weight that couldn't be dismissed with a clever retort. Still, she pushed forward, unwilling to relinquish her ground. "You chose that path, Major," she said, her voice steady despite the unease rising in her chest. "And you must bear its consequences." Ethan's response was measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to his tone. "You're right," he said. "I do bear those consequences every single day. But I made those choices so people like you wouldn't have to. And if that makes me a pawn, so be it." Without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Lila standing alone on the stage. The audience, too, began to disperse, their applause muted and uncertain. Lila had won the argument in the eyes of some, but the victory felt hollow. Deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something profound. As she watched Ethan disappear into the crowd, Lila couldn't help but wonder, what kind of truth could leave even the most resolute warrior silent? She was determined to find out. That night, as she replayed the confrontation in her mind, a thought gnawed at her. What if Ethan's silence wasn't an admission of guilt, but a reflection of truths too complex to distill into words? For the first time in her career as an activist, Lila felt uncertain, and that uncertainty would lead her down a path she never expected. Lila's days following the gala spiraled into a whirlwind of public attention. The video of her confrontation with Major Ethan Carver had gone viral, igniting fierce debates across every corner of the internet. To her supporters, she was a fearless activist daring to speak uncomfortable truths about the military-industrial complex. To her critics, she was an opportunist who had publicly humiliated a decorated veteran. Amidst the chaos, Lila couldn't escape the nagging doubt growing inside her. What if you were wrong? Her inbox overflowed with interview requests, opinion pieces, and even hate mail. At first, Lila dismissed the criticism as the knee-jerk reaction of people unwilling to question their institutions. But as the days passed, she found herself unable to shake the memory of Ethan's calm yet piercing words. He hadn't shouted or retaliated. Instead, he had spoken with a quiet conviction that lingered far longer than she expected. One night, as she scrolled through her mentions, she stumbled upon a Twitter thread that stopped her cold. It was written by someone claiming to have served alongside Ethan during a classified mission. The user recounted how Ethan had disobeyed direct orders to save a group of civilians trapped in a combat zone. "He's no pawn," the post read. "He's a hero. Call him what you want, but he's the reason I'm alive." Dozens of replies followed, echoing similar sentiments. Medics, soldiers, and even civilians shared their stories of Ethan's courage and humanity. They painted a picture of a man who wasn't just a soldier, but a protector, someone who carried the weight of his choices with quiet dignity. Lila read through the thread in stunned silence, each post chipping away at the foundation of her argument. The next morning, a package arrived at her doorstep. It was small, unmarked, and mysterious. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Miss Brandt, justice requires understanding. The drive contains footage from one of my missions. Watch it. Ethan Carver." With trembling hands, Lila inserted the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered to life and she was transported into a world she had only read about. The footage was raw, filled with the deafening sounds of gunfire and chaos. Through the shaky camera, she saw soldiers navigating a bombed-out village, their faces etched with tension. Ethan's voice rose above the noise, calm and commanding, as he directed his team and comforted frightened civilians. One scene hit her harder than the rest. Ethan was shown carrying a wounded child, her tiny body limp in his arms. "We're not leaving her behind," he shouted, his voice thick with resolve. The camera followed him as he sprinted through the rubble, bullets whizzing past. The footage ended abruptly, leaving Lila staring at the black screen, her heart pounding. This wasn't the man she had accused of being a pawn. This was someone grappling with impossible choices, risking everything to protect lives. Lila felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized how limited her understanding had been. She had reduced Ethan's life to a caricature, using him as a prop in her speech without considering the weight of his reality. Unable to shake the image of Ethan carrying the child, Lila drafted an email. "I want to understand," she wrote. "Please give me the chance to hear your story." She sent it before she could second-guess herself. Days passed with no response. Lila began to think she would never hear from him. But just as she was about to move on, an email appeared in her inbox. The subject line was simple: "Meet me." The message was even simpler: "Pine Street Cafe, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come alone." The next morning, Lila arrived early, her nerves raw. The cozy cafe was quiet, its warmth a stark contrast to the tension she felt. She chose a seat by the window, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When Ethan walked in, his presence seemed to command the room. He greeted her with a nod and took the seat across from her. "Miss Brandt," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Why are you here?" Lila hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I was wrong," she admitted finally. "I judged you without knowing your story. I need to understand." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "The truth isn't easy," he said after a moment, "but if you're willing to listen, I'll tell you." For the next hour, Ethan spoke, and Lila listened. He didn't justify every decision he'd made or defend the institution he had served. Instead, he shared his experiences, the lives he couldn't save, the compromises he had to make, and the weight of those choices. His words were raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. By the time their conversation ended, Lila felt a profound shift within herself. Ethan wasn't a pawn. He was a man thrust into impossible situations, navigating a world of moral ambiguity with courage and dignity. For the first time, Lila saw the shades of gray she had ignored, and for the first time she began to question not just Ethan, but herself. The days following Lila's conversation with Ethan were marked by a strange quiet in her usually chaotic life. The uproar from the viral video had started to die down, but the echoes of their meeting refused to leave her mind. Ethan's stories, raw and unfiltered, replayed over and over. She hadn't expected him to share so much, nor had she anticipated the depth of her own ignorance. Now, every soundbite she'd ever crafted about war and justice seemed woefully inadequate. Lila had always seen herself as a champion of truth, but for the first time, she questioned whether she even understood what that meant. She began revisiting her past speeches, combing through articles she'd written, trying to understand how she had missed so much, but no amount of reflection could prepare her for the next development. One afternoon, while scrolling through her inbox, Lila noticed an email with a subject line that sent a chill down her spine. Perspective. It was from Ethan. She clicked it open with a mix of dread and curiosity. "Miss Brandt, if you want to understand, meet me at the address below. Bring an open mind and nothing else. Ethan." The address led her to an old community center on the outskirts of town. It was a nondescript building, weathered and unremarkable. Lila hesitated at the entrance, her palms sweaty and heart racing. She had no idea what to expect. When she finally stepped inside, the sight that greeted her took her breath away. The room was filled with veterans, men and women of all ages, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall, their faces etched with lines of experience. The air was heavy with a mix of solemnity and camaraderie. Ethan stood at the center, his calm presence commanding the room. "Miss Brandt," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of conversation. "You wanted to understand. This is where it starts." Lila nodded, her usual confidence replaced by a tentative curiosity. She took a seat in the circle of chairs that had been arranged, feeling every pair of eyes on her. Ethan introduced her to the group, explaining briefly who she was and why she had come. There was no hostility in their gazes, only a guarded curiosity. Over the next few hours, Lila listened as each veteran shared their story. Some spoke of the camaraderie that had kept them going, while others recounted the horrors they had witnessed. One man, who introduced himself as Sam, described the day his convoy was ambushed, leaving him the sole survivor. "You don't just walk away from that," he said, his voice trembling. "You carry it with you, every day." Another woman, Maria, spoke about the moral compromises she had to make. "There's no black and white in war," she said, "only shades of gray. You do what you have to, but it never leaves you." Each story was a window into a world Lila had never truly understood. She had always spoken about war in abstract terms, policies, systems, and ideologies. But here, in this room, it was personal. These weren't just soldiers, they were human beings grappling with choices no one should have to make. By the time the last story was told, Lila felt emotionally drained. She looked around the room, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I thought I understood war, but I didn't. Not really." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Understanding doesn't come easy, Miss Brandt. It's not something you can learn from books or speeches. You have to listen. To really listen." One of the veterans leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're brave for coming here," he said. "Most people would rather criticize from a distance than face the truth up close." Lila felt a lump rise in her throat. She had come to the center expecting answers, but all she had found were more questions. Yet in those questions, she felt a strange sense of clarity. As the meeting came to an end, Ethan approached her. "You've taken the first step," he said, "but the road ahead isn't easy. Are you ready for that?" Lila nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she was. "I want to try," she said. "I need to." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then you're on the right path." That night, Lila sat in her apartment, replaying the stories she had heard. For the first time, she began to see herself not as an advocate with all the answers, but as a student with much to learn. She realized that understanding wasn't just about knowing the facts. It was about connecting with the people behind them. The next day, she drafted a statement to her followers. "I've spent years speaking about justice and morality," she wrote, "but I've come to realize how much I've overlooked. I've judged from a distance, never truly listening to the stories of those I've criticized. That changes now." The post went live, and the response was immediate. Some praised her honesty, while others accused her of backtracking. But for the first time, Lila didn't care about the opinions of others. She was focused on the journey ahead, a journey toward understanding, empathy, and perhaps redemption. In the weeks that followed her meeting with the veterans, Lila found herself immersed in a world she had previously kept at arm's length. Determined to honor the promise she had made to Ethan and to herself, she began attending regular gatherings at the community center. The stories she heard each week were not only humbling, but also deeply transformative. The veterans shared their struggles with reintegration, their sleepless nights, and the heavy weight of memories they couldn't escape. One day, Ethan approached her after a particularly emotional meeting. "You're learning," he said, his tone almost approving. "But there's something more you need to see." Lila tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" Ethan handed her an envelope. Inside was a plane ticket to a small town in the Midwest and a note. "Sometimes, to understand the present, you need to confront the past. Meet me there." Lila hesitated. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this felt different. It felt personal. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity and the growing need to uncover the layers of Ethan's life and the lives of those like him. When Lila arrived in the town, she was struck by how ordinary it seemed. Rows of modest houses, a quiet main street, and a single diner that appeared to be the town's hub. Ethan was waiting for her outside the diner, dressed simply, his expression unreadable as always. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as they shook hands. "I wasn't sure either," Lila admitted. "What is this place?" Ethan gestured for her to follow. They walked in silence, the only sounds coming from the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Finally, they stopped in front of a modest home with a small, well-tended garden. "This was my family's house," Ethan said quietly. "I grew up here. It's where I made the decision to enlist." Lila blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because understanding isn't just about hearing stories," Ethan said. "It's about seeing the choices, the context, the moments that define a person." He led her inside, where the walls were adorned with faded photographs and mementos of a simpler time. Ethan pointed to a picture of a young boy, no older than 10, standing next to a man in a military uniform. "That's me with my dad. He served in Vietnam. I grew up hearing his stories, not the sanitized versions, but the raw truth. He never wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to, that I owed it to him, to my family." Lila listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time she saw Ethan not as a soldier or a symbol, but as a human being shaped by his experiences and his choices. The rest of the day was spent walking through the town, with Ethan pointing out landmarks from his childhood. The school where he had gotten into his first fight, the park where he had learned to play baseball, the bridge where he had kissed his first girlfriend. Each memory added another layer to the person she thought she had understood. That evening they sat on the porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the quiet street. Ethan handed Lila a notebook. "These are letters I wrote during my tours," he said. "Some I sent, some I didn't. They're not easy to read, but they're honest." Lila opened the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. The first letter was addressed to his mother. As she read through the pages, she was struck by the raw emotion, the fear, the hope, and the despair that bled through every word. It was a window into a reality she could never have imagined. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you wanted to understand," Ethan said simply. "This is part of it. The choices I made, the things I've seen, they're all here." By the time Lila finished reading, tears streaked her face. She looked at Ethan, her voice cracking as she said, "I don't know how you carry this." Ethan shrugged, his gaze distant. "You don't have a choice. You just keep moving." As they parted ways the next day, Lila felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. Ethan had entrusted her with his story, and she was determined to honor it. When she returned home, Lila began writing. Not a speech or an article, but a reflection, something deeply personal. She shared snippets of Ethan's letters with his permission, framing them within the larger context of the veterans' struggles and sacrifices. The piece went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. People resonated with the honesty, the vulnerability, the humanity. Ethan called her after it was published. "You did good, Brandt," he said, a rare hint of warmth in his voice. For the first time in a long while, Lila felt like she was on the right path, not just as an activist, but as a human being striving to truly understand the complexities of the world around her. The impact of Lila's piece rippled far beyond her expectations. Messages flooded her inbox. Not the usual polarized comments, but heartfelt stories and gratitude from veterans and their families. For the first time in her career, Lila felt part of something bigger. She had opened a dialogue that had been long overdue. But with this purpose came an unexpected challenge, an invitation to speak at a national conference on military reintegration. The conference, hosted in Washington, D.C., brought together policymakers, veterans, and advocates to discuss reintegration challenges. Lila hesitated before accepting. She had spent years criticizing war, but her perspective had shifted. The thought of addressing such a diverse audience filled her with doubt. Who was she, after all, to speak on behalf of experiences she would never truly understand? Ethan called the night before her flight. "You're nervous," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm terrified," Lila admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I offend someone?" "You're not there to give answers," Ethan replied. "Speak from the heart and the rest will follow. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real." The conference venue was a sprawling center filled with thousands of attendees. Lila spent the first day attending panels, listening to veterans share their struggles with PTSD, families recount their grief over loved ones lost to war, and policymakers grapple with the complexities of reintegration. Each story weighed on her, but it also fueled her determination to do justice to the moment she had been given. When the time came, Lila stepped onto the stage, her palms damp and her heart pounding. The audience was a sea of faces, some familiar, some not. She scanned the crowd until her eyes landed on Ethan, sitting calmly in the second row. His presence steadied her. "I want to start by saying that I'm not an expert," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never served. For a long time I thought that gave me clarity to critique from a distance. But I was wrong." The room grew silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. "I judged without understanding," she continued. "I spoke about war and justice as if they were abstract concepts, without considering the people whose lives are shaped by them. But over the past few months, I've had the privilege of listening, really listening, to the stories of veterans. And what I've learned is that the truth isn't black and white. It's messy, complicated, and deeply human." Lila shared snippets from Ethan's letters, as well as the stories she had heard at the community center. She spoke about the moral complexities of war, the invisible scars veterans carried, and the challenges of reintegration. Her words weren't polished or rehearsed, but they were genuine. As she spoke, she felt the energy in the room shift. People leaned forward in their seats, their expressions softening. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Layla stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over her before stepping off the stage. After her speech, attendees lined up to speak with her. A young man in uniform thanked her for voicing the struggles his father had faced. An older woman, her eyes brimming with tears, said Lila's words had helped her forgive herself for not understanding her son's struggles after he returned from war. Ethan found her later in the evening, a rare smile playing on his lips. "You did good, Brandt," he said. "You spoke your truth." "That means a lot coming from you," Lila replied, her voice tinged with emotion. As the conference came to a close, Lila felt a profound sense of purpose. She knew her journey was far from over, but she was ready to continue it, not as a critic standing on the sidelines, but as an ally walking alongside those she had once judged. When Lila returned home, she and Ethan began a new project together. They launched a platform called Voices of Valor, a space where veterans could share their stories with the public. The goal was to bridge the gap between the military and civilian worlds through dialogue and storytelling. The platform quickly gained traction, attracting stories from veterans across the country. Each narrative added to the growing tapestry of experiences, highlighting the resilience, sacrifice, and humanity of those who had served. Lila found herself in a role she had never imagined, not as a critic, but as a facilitator of understanding. One day, as she reviewed submissions for the platform, Lila received an email from a young soldier who had watched her speech online. The subject line read, "Thank you." In the message, he wrote about how her words had helped him feel seen for the first time. Her honesty, he said, had given him the courage to seek help for his PTSD. Lila stared at the screen, her chest tightening with emotion. She forwarded the email to Ethan with a simple note. "This is why." Ethan's reply was equally succinct. "Keep going." For the first time, Lila felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not as an activist with all the answers, but as a human being committed to learning, growing, and making a difference. Months had passed since the launch of Voices of Valor, and the platform had become more than just a project for Lila. It had become a movement. Stories poured in from all corners of the country, from veterans of every generation. Some spoke of triumph, others of pain, but all of them carried an undeniable thread of humanity. For the first time in her life, Lila felt as though she was truly making a difference. One story, however, stood out. It came from a retired medic named Owen, who described an operation in which Ethan had saved not only him, but also several civilians caught in crossfire. The details were harrowing. Sacrifices made, lives lost, and Ethan's refusal to leave anyone behind, even when it meant risking his own life. Owen ended his submission with a simple line: "Ethan Carver doesn't see himself as a hero, but to me, and to many others, he always will be." Lila forwarded the story to Ethan with a note: "You can't hide from the truth forever." His reply was as brief as ever: "You exaggerate." Ethan's humility was one of the many things that continued to surprise her. Despite the overwhelming praise he received from those who knew him, he remained grounded, almost to a fault. But Lila was determined to help him see himself the way others did. One day, while reviewing submissions, Lila received an email from a journalist who had been following her journey. The journalist proposed creating a documentary about Voices of Valor, focusing on the stories shared and the impact the platform was having on bridging the divide between veterans and civilians. Lila was hesitant at first. She had never sought the spotlight, but the idea of amplifying these voices on a larger scale was too important to pass up. When she called Ethan to discuss the proposal, he was characteristically wary. "This isn't about me, Brandt," he said. "It's about the stories. Don't let them get lost in the noise." "They won't," Lila assured him, "but people need to see the faces behind these stories. They need to know the sacrifices and the humanity behind the headlines." Ethan reluctantly agreed, on the condition that the focus remained on the veterans and not on him. Lila promised to honor his wishes, and the project moved forward. Over the next few months, the documentary began to take shape. The filmmakers interviewed dozens of veterans who had contributed to Voices of Valor. They traveled to small towns and big cities, capturing raw, unfiltered stories of resilience, pain, and hope. Ethan, true to his word, participated but kept the focus on others. "I'm just one piece of a much larger puzzle," he told the cameras. When the documentary premiered, the response was overwhelming. Audiences were moved to tears, inspired to act, and, most importantly, motivated to listen. Donations to veteran support programs surged, and conversations about reintegration and mental health took center stage in ways they hadn't before. Lila watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. She knew this wasn't her victory alone. It belonged to everyone who had shared their story and to those who had taken the time to listen. After the premiere, Ethan and Lila stood outside the theater, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. "You did good, Brandt," Ethan said, his tone lighter than usual. "We did good," she corrected, smiling. "This was your story, too." Ethan shook his head. "It was everyone's story. You just helped bring it to the surface." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling around them. Lila knew this wasn't the end. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time, she felt at peace with the path she had chosen. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me, for challenging me, for everything." Ethan's lips curved into a rare smile. "Thank you for listening." As they parted ways that night, Lila felt a profound sense of closure, not because the work was finished, but because she had finally found her purpose. She wasn't just an activist or a storyteller. She was someone who had learned to listen, to grow, and to connect. Years later, when Voices of Valor had become a cornerstone of dialogue between veterans and civilians, Lila would look back on the journey that had brought her there. She would remember the moment she met Ethan, the stories that had changed her, and the people who had trusted her with their truths, and she would know, without a doubt, that she had done something meaningful, not because she had all the answers, but because she had been willing to ask the questions. Ethan's voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the lessons she had learned. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real. And in that, Lila found her truth.